Hello everyone, I'm Caitlin Teeter, and on today's Teeter Tales, I'm going to be doing a ranking of classic dog books. I know the definition of classic can be a bit tricky. For some people, it's books that have had a good reception and are well known. For others, it's based on the age of the book. So for this video, I'm going to be covering dog books that are old and or well known and well received. I will only be including dog books that I have read. However, some of these I have not read since late middle school, so my memory on them may not be perfect. There will be spoilers in my ranking. I will try and let you know when I'm going to be giving spoilers on them, but I kind of need to give spoilers for the books to talk about my opinion on some of them. I'll emphasize that this is my personal opinion and not an objective ranking of these books, so don't think I'm trying to say one book is objectively better than the other. Let's go ahead and get started. At the very bottom of my list, coming in at number 9, is Old Yeller. This might surprise some people because Old Yeller is one of the classic dog books people tend to think of, but I found this book disappointing and think it's one of the rare instances where the movie's actually better than the book. I did not like the human characters in this book. Little Arliss and Travis were both really irritating for me, and Travis first person narrates this book, so that just made it hard to read for me. There was also some racism in the book towards Native Americans, and that made some parts uncomfortable. I will also point out there is a sequel to Old Yeller called Savage Sam, which the name should tell you something. It's so racist, I would say don't even bother with it. I could not read it. Spoilers for the ending of Old Yeller, though I feel like most people know how this book ends. I didn't even cry when Old Yeller got shot at the end. I am normally a sucker for crying whenever something happens to a dog in a book or a movie, but I just didn't care enough about this book to cry when that happened. I know lots of people love Old Yeller, it's a classic, but I just did not enjoy it. This next book I don't have a physical copy to show you, and it is White Fang. Some of you may not have heard of White Fang, but you may have heard of the better known Call of the Wild by Jack London. White Fang is another dog book by Jack London, and ironically, I have not read Call of the Wild, but I have read White Fang, so that's the one I'll be talking about. White Fang is a difficult book to get through. I did thoroughly enjoy parts, especially towards the end of the book, but other parts were downright depressing. Jack London was an interesting writer. He had a very naturalistic outlook on life, which also meant he was very pessimistic, and that's very apparent in his writing. White Fang suffers a lot throughout the book, and it can just be hard to read. And even though, spoiler, the book does end happily, it still gets dragged down by the early portions of this book with the dog fighting and just general abuse White Fang suffers. There's also a lot of racism in this book. That's a big part of why Jack London is a controversial writer now. He was very racist toward Native Americans especially, and that comes through very strongly in this book. All in all, White Fang is an interesting read that I would say is worth at least one go through, but the negatives definitely outweigh the positives for me. Next up is a more recognizable book, but maybe one you didn't realize was a book and not just a movie. 101 Dalmatians. This is a strange book, and another example where I would say the movie is better than the book. I will point out I may be biased because I grew up watching and loving the Disney 101 Dalmatians, so it was weird going back and listening to the audiobook of this after growing up with that movie. This book feels a bit like a fever dream. Cruella de Vil is heavily implied to actually be a devil of some kind in the book, which lends an element of creepiness to the whole book. The plot is definitely unique, especially having it from the close third-person perspective of the Dalmatian parents, but the book just feels weirdly disjointed and almost like a fever dream, so I couldn't really put it higher than number 7. Next up is a book I actually just finished reading for the first time, and that is Because of Winn-Dixie. I actually don't have strong feelings on this book one way or the other. Opal is a charming, likable protagonist, and I enjoyed her first-person narration. It was also nice having a wide cast of characters with very unique personalities. I just felt the book was so short, I didn't have time to get invested in any of them. The book was also a bit odd in that it mostly felt grounded in the real world, but then had a few fantastic elements, such as Otis playing his guitar and all the animals in the pet store behaving for him, or the litmus lozenges, which are a candy that tastes like sadness. Overall, this book was enjoyable. I just didn't have strong feelings on it. Now here's a book that I would think most of you would recognize, and that is Lassie Come Home. Lassie can actually run a bit on the slow and depressing side, as Lassie suffers very frequently throughout her journey home. And spoiler, even though the ending is happy, in a way, kind of like White Fang, it can be painful getting there. The book isn't nearly as depressing as some others, and it's still entertaining to read. However, I found myself caring more about the people Lassie comes across in her journey than the boy she's actually traveling home to reunite with. Lassie seemed like a book which I should have liked a lot more than I did, and it just doesn't click with me. Now we're getting into the top 4, which for me are leaps and bounds ahead of all the other books at this point. And coming in at number 4, we have Big Red. I'm a sucker for books that have the human character and the dog having to grow and learn alongside each other, and Big Red does that really well. Danny and Red have a lot of growing to do, and they both kind of have to mature and learn from each other. There are lots of memorable scenes, whether it's the dog show or Red's confrontation with the Wolverine, that make this book stand out. The dynamics between other characters like Danny and his father are also really fun to read, and I love the knowledge that the book incorporates on dogs, showing the differences between dog breeds, like how Danny has to create a new training method for Red, an Irish setter, than what his father uses with their hunting hounds. Honestly, my main critique of this book can be summed up by the end of the book. Spoilers, since I'm talking about the end of the book. Once Red and Sheila have their first litter of puppies, Danny thinks that the pups will be even better than their parents. This comes across as really ungrateful since Red has just saved Danny's life. And it ties into a general problem I have with Danny's character in that he can come across as greedy in his ambition for greatness in breeding dogs, and can sometimes make it feel like he's dismissing the individual dogs for what the breed can give him. Still, I do really enjoy this book, and it definitely has way more positive than negative. Now on to the top 3, and coming in at 3rd place is The Incredible Journey. Though less well known than Lassie, I actually like this journey story better than Lassie. The book manages to feel like a full narrative and like an incredible journey, despite being just over 140 pages. Having the dynamic of 2 dogs and a cat of varying ages really makes the book stand out, and I was able to get invested in each of the animals individually. The animals do suffer on their way home and experience hardship, but rather than feeling depressing, it actually builds the investment and makes you root for the animals all the more. Spoilers, but it's immensely satisfying once they finally do make it home, especially seeing old Bodker get there. Now we're on to my top 2, and I absolutely adore both of these books, and would highly recommend both of them. And for 2nd place, I have Lad, a dog. This book is probably one of the least well-known books on this list, however, it is one of my favorite dog books, obviously, to date. The fact that this book was actually based on the author's real-life dog, Lad, shows in the writing and makes this book really special and stand out. Even with the more fantastic and fictionalized stories, Lad still feels like a much more grounded dog book because Terhune is telling stories about a dog he really had. Lad is one of, if not my favorite dogs in dog books. And when I read the afterword, once I finished the book, that talked about how Lad died in real life, I actually teared up, even though this was a dog that I knew had died in the early 1900s. Terhune is definitely a wordy writer, but I think that fits the subject matter well. You can tell how much he loves dogs and knows about dogs in his writing, and that makes this book stand out. Finally, number 1, my absolute favorite dog book, is Where the Red Fern Grows. I'm going to have full spoilers for this book as I talk about it, because it's hard to discuss my feelings on it without talking about the ending. This is the first book that made me truly sob. The ending is still one of the most heart-wrenching endings I have ever read in a book, and unlike White Fang, which just felt genuinely depressing, there is a sort of beauty in the tragic ending of this book. Part of why I fell in love with this book is the character of Billy. He tells the story from first person, although he's telling it as an adult looking back at his childhood, and unlike Travis in Old Yeller, Billy is really likable. He's very earnest and is willing to work however hard he needs to be able to get a pair of dogs, and that made me get invested in his story and in his dogs right away. I'll point out I actually knew that this book ended with the tragic deaths of his dogs, and I still got really invested in Billy, Old Dan, and Little Ann, and I felt like I had gone on a journey with all three of them. Reading about the hunting exploits of Billy and how he trained his dogs and grew alongside them was also really enjoyable to read and cemented Where the Red Fern Grows as my favorite dog book. There are, of course, many dog books which I have not read, and others which I have read before, but I don't remember well enough to put on this list. For example, I did listen to the audiobooks of the Shiloh book series when I was in elementary school, but I felt my memory was too poor to fairly include them on this list. As someone who loves and has a couple dogs of my own, dog books have been a frequent part of my reading experience, so if you have any suggestions for dog books you would recommend I read, I would love to hear it. Again, this is my own personal ranking, and I'm not objectively saying Where the Red Fern Grows is better than Lassie, but it's just my own preference for these books. If you have your own favorites or least favorite dog books you want to share, go ahead and put that in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this ranking video. Bye!